Hello and welcome. I'm Alleen Brown, a reporter at the Intercept, and we are here today to talk about the movement to defund and dismantle the police force in my hometown of Minneapolis. Following the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer on Memorial Day, Minneapolis City Council members unanimously approved a resolution to create a transformative new model for cultivating safety in Minneapolis. 9 of 12 members went so far as committing to dismantling the department. Here is City Council President Lisa Bender.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it, and to recreate systems of public safety that actually keep us safe.
So the groundwork for this watershed moment was laid over the course of years by racial justice organizers in the city as they responded to repeated police killings of civilians and observed the failures of reform efforts. The national uprisings that Floyd's murder inspired set the stage for radical commitments by public officials. But now comes the really hard part, which is transforming this vision of a more just public security system into a reality. So here to talk about this is two of the key players in the movement to defund the police in Minneapolis. I'm here with Miski Noor, an organizer with Black Visions Collective, which has been a leader since before Floyd's murder and shifting the goals of the Twin Cities anti-police brutality movement toward police defunding. As people poured into the streets in the days after Memorial Day, Black Vision sprung to action, immediately delivering a list of demands to city council members to defund the force. I'm also with Jeremiah Ellison, a Minneapolis City Council member who came into politics via his activism. Jeremiah became involved in the fight against police brutality when the movement really took off in the city in 2015, after Jamar Clark, a young, unarmed Black man, was killed by Minneapolis police. As the movement has gained strength, police brutality has increasingly become an important question in electoral politics in the city, and Jeremiah had assumed office in 2018. So welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
To get started, I'd love it if each of you could kind of paint a picture of a Minneapolis without police for me, or with a dramatically defunded police force. What would that Minneapolis be like? How does it change the texture of the city? And maybe Miski can start.
Yeah, I think that, thanks for this question. Thanks for having us here. I really think that Minneapolis without police is really asking people to live into their imagination and lean into what could really be possible for our city. I think a Minneapolis without police looks like our communities, all of our communities, having their needs met around affordable and safe housing, around access to healthcare, around to good jobs that pay them for their labor in appropriate ways. Minneapolis where all of us feel comfortable walking down all of our blocks, and that we feel secure and connected to each other. And, you know, we have to really use our imaginations. And we also know that we're not asking for something that is completely impossible, because in many wealthy, well-connected neighborhoods around this country and around this world, that exists for people right now. And the demand is really that it exists for all of Minneapolis.
Thank you. And Jeremiah, anything to add?
Yeah, I don't know if I can say it any better. I know that I think that for a long time we have poured funding into the police department at the expense of other things. City budgets are not limitless, right? And so while it can be a strain to maybe get $1 million towards efforts that might help small businesses, it can be, it seems to be no problem at all to get $4 million, $5 million, $8 million poured into the police budget. And so I think that's got to change. We know that the things that really contribute to whether or not you have, violence in an area has more to do with how financially secure people are and how much they're making, as opposed to how brutal or how constricting your police force can be, right? So, I think that Miski's vision is right in line. Now, of course, people are going to have questions, and I know I've gotten it from constituents. Well, who's going to solve murders, and who's going to, respond to those situations that are really difficult to de-escalate? The truth is, we do have to have an answer for that, right? But I think as we imagine what this new system of public safety can be, I hope that we start with prevention and prevention of violence, and then work our way towards response. Because as of right now, we start with response, and we make it as big and as loud and as violent as we can make it, and that's whether or not somebody is caught with a fake $20 bill or an active shooter situation. We've decided that response, that emergency requires a gun and use of force training. Should it? Should every encounter necessitate a gun and use of force training? I don't think so. And that's what we want to work towards.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I normally cover or primarily cover environmental justice issues. And so a lot of this conversation reminds me of the transition planning that's happening around the Green New Deal. In that context, what's needed to move away from fossil fuel-based energy is this multi-sector, kind of all hands on deck rethinking of how we function as a society. So it sort of feels like something similar might be required here. This major rethinking of systems of security and emergency management that starts before there's a response needed. What elements does a transition plan have to have for moving away from the police? And Jeremiah, if you want to start on that one, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the first thing we have to do is remove roadblocks towards this vision. I think that, at the city, we love to sort of blame the state for getting in our way on a lot of different policies. But when it comes to this, we start in our own way. We mandate that we have a police department in our charter, which is like a municipal city constitution. And so I think it starts with saying, hey, look, if we want public safety to encompass more than just policing, then what we need is not a police department ratified in our charter. What we need is a Department of Public Safety. And so we're starting there. Let's get out of our own way. Let's allow ourselves and give ourselves permission to expand what public safety can mean beyond just policing. And so I think that that's step one. And obviously step two is to continue to engage with community and with folks who can push us the way that Miski and others in the community have pushed us to expand our imagination at City Hall of what public safety can encompass. At City Hall, we often have this I call it, sort of this cult of pragmatism, right? Real pragmatism, but you convince yourself that the status quo is pragmatic. You convince yourself that a lack of creativity is pragmatic, and so you don't change. And I think that folks have folks like, not to just keep giving you props, Miski, but folks like Miski, folks like Black Visions, and obviously folks who are not folks who are not affiliated with
you've been in these streets too.
have continued to give us that creativity and help us expand beyond our limited scope. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Miski, I'm curious to hear from you, especially where it comes to some of that kind of long-term vision building. It sounds like right now the work at hand is dealing with this charter, but there's also some steps that might come down the road that perhaps require some building now. I guess, how are you thinking of that kind of like long-term envisioning in terms of a transition planning?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, so even what you just named there, right? Like right now, a lot of our energy has been focused on pressuring the city around this charter amendment. And we've also begun to actually engage partner organizations in dialogue about next steps and what transition actually looks like, because it's going to take so many of us to frame what this actually looks like. All of us, all of the city of Minneapolis is responsible for imagining what public safety could look like, and we all need to have a hand and a part in this conversation. Part of the reason we're even here is because, you know, the history of failed reforms inside of the Minneapolis Police Department, and that community engagement work is really, really necessary. And so really, you know, the process right now in order to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department has to be to amend the city's charter, which is essentially the city's constitution. And we need to remove the police department from the charter to be able to establish a new department of violence prevention and public safety. And without this change, our city is actually very limited in its authority to actually be able to defund and dismantle the police department. And tomorrow, the city council is going to be voting on whether or not to put this amendment on the ballot and what the actual language will be. And so right now we're asking all of Minneapolis to call the city council and let them know that the amendment has to have language in there that really does remove the power and the scope and the existence of the police department as is, so that when, you know, hopefully when this charter goes to Minneapolis voters, it's actually what it is that we need. And I think, you know, what Jeremiah was saying about like deep community engagement is really, really critical. And in deep community engagement that really prioritize the inclusion and accessibility of those communities that have been most impacted by police violence, and especially Black communities. And then like actually really dreaming with our community members and the city council to really negotiate reductions in size and scope of the police force and its operations, to scale back the MPD through different procedural measures, and to also engage, right, in other strategies of abolition as well, right? So defunding the police is one way towards abolition of the police, but there's also decarceration. There's also decriminalization. So what does it mean to actually do the work to decriminalize city ordinances that criminalize our people in really awful and violent ways, and other criminalized economies even, right? And then lastly, like really doing the work to committing to sustain funding for community-led safety programs like the Office of Violence Prevention, and other alternatives. And so it's really about being inside of imagination and experimentation to create some of these new structures that actually honor the humanity of Black folks. And so the city of Minneapolis can really honestly and honorably say, we care about everybody that lives here.
And I know that Black Visions has been pushing the mayor and the city council to defund the police for at least a couple of years. You know, tell me, Miski, about the efforts to defund the police that led up to this moment. You know, what did you learn from that past organizing and those past efforts that you're taking forward into this new moment?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. You know, I really think that organizing or organizations or movement like cannot take credit, right, for everything that is possible in this moment, right? But movement and organization is able to help give meaning, help give a container, and really use the energy of our people to change and really change the material conditions on the ground and make new things possible. And so that is a part of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. You know, Reclaim the Block and Black Visions were successful in 2018, getting the city council to move $1.1 million of the police department budget and into alternatives like the Office of Violence Prevention. Now, what I will say is, before the murder of George Floyd, the city council was making moves to actually cut that. When we only got it 2 years ago, and we haven't even had a chance to see the impact it could have in our communities, right? And so it is like communities and community organizations pushing our city councils to be visionary, right? What is happening in Minneapolis can be possible in many different cities if folks keep the pressure up on their city councils and continue to be in relationship and doing that work, right? It's the work of being in the streets, doing direct action, and then also being in direct conversation to help push and change and really engender political will on the behalf of Black communities and get our elected officials to act in ways that really do increase the safety of our communities. And so that's, I think, some of the work that we've been doing. And I also want to say it's not just Minneapolis, right? We build on the legacy of Black organizing and the legacy of abolition work all across this country that's been happening for decades. And so defund the police, became a huge symbolic demand coming out of Minneapolis. But Black organizations, Black movement has been calling for the defunding and the divestment from institutions and systems that kill our people, dehumanize our people, and into investments that actually promote the thriving lives of our people. And so this is continuous work that we build upon and will continue to do so.
And for you, Jeremiah, going back, you went from being an activist in the midst of Jamar Clark protests to finding yourself in the seat of, politicians you perhaps once criticized. Has being in this elected role changed the way you think about what kind of transformation is possible or how you get there? And also, how has it changed your relationship with the activist community that, you were once, that maybe are still your peers, but in a different way?
Yeah. I have to, often I feel like folks might think I came from the activist world, and I certainly have to give credit to folks like Candace Montgomery and Miski for pulling me in, but I actually started very much so as a muralist and as an artist and as a painter. I spent a lot of my time just kind of in my studio, trying my best to mind my own business, but I found myself kind of pulled into the street by my friends who really felt like it was important that I be there to support folks on the ground, support folks leading the work. I remember during the first morning after the start of the occupation, which started off kind of small with a few people sleeping in the doorway. Me and my girlfriend at the time came and delivered breakfast. Like, that was kind of the first role that I really, took in that during that protest. I think that, I feel like my role, I have not changed what I think is possible, right? I do think that there are ways in which you enter into a system that has worked one particular way for however many 100+ years, and it can grind on you and it can make you feel a little pessimistic, right? And I talked about that cult of pragmatism. It can wear away at your creativity a little bit, and I come from the creative field, and so that's the last thing I want to see happen to my creativity. I think it's important when you occupy a seat of decision making and power to really keep that in perspective. One of the things that I always resented about other electeds when I would encounter them before I ran myself was that folks would often be so averse to criticism. And so when I got elected, I wanted to do was make sure that it was impossible to burn a bridge with me. Meaning, just because we disagree right now, or just because somebody might come cuss me out, and I might feel like it's unfair on the inside, but I've got to be tough enough to hear that, to consider that what they're saying is true, even if I don't like the style of delivery, and to apply their words to the work that we're doing, to the work that I do. And so, for me, I think that obviously, the relationship changes because sometimes there are things in which there are votes that I can't get, or there are actions that I can't get the vote for, and there are things that I'm going to find it really difficult to move, and there are going to be days where I'm really burnt out and wondering if anybody has my back or anything, But ultimately, I try to keep perspective, and I try to remember that as somebody who has this kind of decision-making power, it's really important that I not allow my feelings to sort of get the best of me and start, alienating my friends just because I don't necessarily always like the tone they're taking or whatever. I always tell folks it's impossible to burn a bridge. So.
And I guess I'm curious, to hear from both of you. Like, Jeremiah, what do you feel like you need from the activist community to do your job effectively? And Miski, what do you feel like? I mean, maybe that answer to what you need from City Council is more obvious, but I'd love to hear like what you need from each other.
You want to go first, or you want me to go first, Miski?
I can go, sure. Yeah, toss it to me. I mean, I feel like I feel like I've named some of the things. I mean, with this vote tomorrow, it feels really, really clear, right? Our community has been pushing really hard on the City Council to change the charter to eliminate the Minneapolis Police Department, and we need them to do it right. And currently the language that the council is considering would take some important steps to eliminate the Minneapolis Police Department, but it still leaves room currently for former officers to participate and potentially lead a future public safety division. And it would actually give current and former police way too much power around shaping the future of safety in Minneapolis, when they have proven, and the reason we are inside of this process is that they cannot handle the job of ensuring the safety of especially Black people in Minneapolis. And we know that the police are already going to be doing everything they can to influence this process. The history of its entire institution is a history of desperate and harmful attempts to actually maintain power. And so we can't afford to give them any additional leverage by actually writing them into the charter amendment. And so really want to, been naming that to City Council, want Minneapolis residents to really hear that too, and name that to their City Council members, so that folks are really clear that cops are not an option in the charter, and that we're calling on them to amend this language before they vote tomorrow. So that's what I need.
No, I hear that, and I've been on the phone with folks from Black Visions, and I'm trying to take that feedback, and I'm trying to figure out how I can best apply it to bring that message to my colleagues in a way that is sustainable and gets us there. I also think that you asked like what I need. I think ultimately, I try not to feel like, I'm not going to give demands to community members, because I understand that my job is to listen, right? I think that if I had my wish list, right, of things that I would love from activists, I always think like, oh man, if I could just get a little bit more trust or a little bit more good faith. But I also understand why elected officials often aren't extended that trust. And so I try to keep that in perspective as well. And not take it personally when folks are like, all right, Jeremiah, we hear you, but we're going to push you a little harder. I think that there are things to critique about the current language, and I think that I'm hearing those critiques, and I'm going to take that back to the council between now and tomorrow's vote. I also think, as written, that we are accomplishing something that, to my knowledge, no other city has really done, which is we are removing the police as a charter department, and we are removing the mandate to have police in our charter. I think that that's a big deal, and while it is not the same as, it is by no means the work of dismantling the department, it really sets us up on that path and makes it possible. We've had some folks, and I know this isn't necessarily Black Vision's perspective, but I know that some folks in the community have pointed to the Camden, New Jersey model, which is not necessarily the model that we're looking to replicate, but it's a model for how you can, reform your police department or make it better or whatever. Our charter currently prevents us from even going down that path. right? And so this would really allow us that. It would get rid of our, minimum. We have a minimum ratio that we have to meet of like police to residents. This would eliminate that. The mayor currently has complete power over the police force, and the council doesn't have any legislative power in our current structure. This would allow us legislative power over this new department, which would, have the law enforcement as a division within it. And I think that, the writing the division of law enforcement into the charter is definitely something that we have gone back and forth as a council. I think where I've landed personally, and I don't have the same opinion as all my colleagues, is that if we are not able to create this new system in short order, we are going to have some element of law enforcement. And I would hate for folks to go to the ballot in November under the impression that they're abolishing the police, only for them to realize that we're not quite there yet, and to feel a little deceived, right? And so I think that I worry about that. And so it feels like, on some level, we're trying to be transparent, but I absolutely also hear those criticisms and the critiques. And I want to be able to find a way in which, we're being transparent about the fact that, hey, this is going to take some time. A lot of residents want to make sure that we're replacing our ability to do certain things before we're completely offloading officers, which I think we can do really quickly as we engage community. But I think that there's a level of transparency that I want to make sure that we have, so that folks don't feel like they voted for one thing only to turn around and realize that that's not quite what happened. So.
I would love to talk a little bit more about Camden, because that's a lot of people's reference point for communities dismantling police. So, in Camden, it's New Jersey, right?
Yep.
In Camden, New Jersey, the reconstituted police force there ended up being larger than its predecessor. Perhaps the murder rate has reportedly dropped. Reports of excessive force complaints have reportedly dropped, but lower level arrests and summons increased significantly. And again, you have many more officers on the street. Is that what we're talking about in Minneapolis? And how different is that from what we mean?
I think that's incredibly different from what we intend. And I kind of jumped in, so Miski, feel free to cut me off if you want to jump in. But
I'll go after you.
I think that's incredibly different than what we want to do. I think the reason it's a useful model to understand is because they did successfully sort of disband. And if you're looking to disband, that's kind of the first step that they took. But you're right that they then went on and sort of created a police force that was designed to address the entire county, I believe. But doesn't address the entire county as of yet. So they're just still so you have the county police now just policing the city. And so, there's more of them and more officers on the ground. I think what we're looking to do is completely transform and completely rethink, I think is a better term, how we're addressing emergency response, right? When is it appropriate when do you need someone? And more importantly, when do you not need someone with use of force training and a gun? I think that's the case for most of the work that the police do, right? They're often spending a lot of their time addressing nonviolent instances that still might need some level of response, right? But if I just keep going back to the murder of George Floyd, and I keep thinking about, did we need 4 guys with use of force training? And I know they didn't use their guns in that instance, but they had them on them, right? Do we need 4 guys with use of force training addressing a forged bill? I mean, we absolutely don't need that, right? It's, in all the ways that you could imagine, it is just a waste of time. It's overkill for the instance. It's dangerous to the person who has supposedly committed that violation. And is that if you are going to have a police force that's supposed to address violent crime, is that a good use of their time? And so I think that on a lot of levels, that stop proved to be a failure. But it's not just that stop, right? We had a couple years ago, since I've been in office, a marijuana sting that was considered by the DA, and we do not have some kind of progressive DA, to be so burdened with racial bias that the DA didn't even prosecute it, right? We've had, in the last couple of years, we had an instance in which multiple officers within MPD were caught instructing EMTs to inject people with ketamine simply because people were maybe mouthing off to them or something, right? That's scary. Could you imagine being injected with an illicit drug against your will, all because maybe you mouthed off to an officer in a way that they didn't like? I mean, that's not appropriate. We also just last year had an instance in which our department lied about the number of untested rape kits they had. They had probably somewhere almost 10 times near the number they said they had reported. And so we've got all these instances in which the police are failing to keep people safe. They're failing to address, crimes that they occur. They're over addressing crimes that don't require force or violence, especially in the case of George Floyd. And I think that we need to rethink what that system's like. Last year, sorry, and I know my answer is getting a little overlong, but last year we did a study of our 911 data, and we found that a lot of our calls, a lot of our officers spend a lot of their time addressing what are called EDP calls, emotionally disturbed person calls. Often, officers are not trained mental health professionals, and yet this is one of the top 5 calls that they get on any given shift. We have things like our mental health response and co-responder program, but they only operate during daytime hours. So if you're having a mental health crisis after 8 o'clock, right, good luck. You're getting a police officer. I think we really need to rethink that system.
Mm-hmm. Yes, all of that. Minneapolis has been the poster child for police reform, which is why we know it doesn't work anywhere. And I think that, the Camden example is not what we want here. We don't want, to give them a new T-shirt. It's not about getting a new uniform or making it countywide instead of citywide. And I think the only other thing that I'll add, that Jeremiah gave such a great answer on Camden, is that, the Camden plan was really a rebranding plan for the city to make it to build a utopia for young white professionals, honestly, and wasn't about actually expanding the definition of safety for everybody. And so that's what we're trying to do in Minneapolis, and create real safety for all of our community members. And I think there's I'll share one little story that I feel really hits on this. One of my favorite things has been seeing all of the different stories inside of our community. And so somebody shared on Facebook yesterday that as they were walking their dog down in South Minneapolis, they saw somebody who was laid out and wasn't sure if they were overdosed or anything like that. So took their dog home, came back with their medical kit. And by the time they came back, there was a mother and a daughter sitting in their car. And they said that they had posted about it on a mutual aid board because they didn't have what they needed to support this person. And they were just going to wait until somebody showed up to support them to make sure that nobody else showed up and called the police, because they don't do that here, right? We don't do that here. And it turned out the person was just dehydrated because they were laying out in the sun. Right. And so why should the police be responding to something of that nature when, as community members, we can be in conversation with each other and provide what is needed in that moment? And I think also this speaks a little bit to the question, Alleen, you were saying earlier about what does safety in Minneapolis look like? What is it that we're envisioning? We're envisioning community members showing up for each other. We're envisioning asking questions and critically thinking about what's necessary in the moment, instead of being let the police deal with this. It's about us actually defining and showing up and implementing safety for one another.
And there's been this sort of incredible blowback in the last week or so, in particular, with these like media reports that have proliferated about a reported increase in violence across the city, with all the speculation that it has something to do with police demoralization, or some kind of informal work stoppage, or people feeling empowered to commit violence because the police are going to go away. You know, Miski, I'm curious what you think about this narrative, and what do you tell community members that are kind of buying into it and are worried that defunding the police means, you know, they're going to get shot or their neighbor's going to get shot and nothing's going to happen?
No, I appreciate that. That's a great question. I think the like increased narrative around like an increased violence is convenient for the police, right? And it takes away from the actual truth and the foundation that the police are the violent force. And that what we're moving away from with policing and moving towards in community-defined safety is actually leaving the danger behind and moving towards that safety. And I think it's actually really, and sorry, before I move on, I think it's really indicative of, you know, the police are going to do what they need to do. They're going to spin what narratives are necessary to be able to hold on to their power. And so we just have to be ready for that. And we have to be grounded in like the true stories. For example, Jeremiah was talking about the missing rape kits, right? Currently, the city of Minneapolis only clears 20% of their rape cases, right? So as of right now, they're not actually creating the necessary safety. And what I want to name is that, you know, as we're also asking folks to go into their imagination around what is possible, we also have to hold their fear. Like, people's fear is legitimate. And it needs to be honored, and we have to name that, and we have to hold folks in their fear. And we have to ask questions around, so what actually could mitigate that fear? What actually would make you feel safe walking down your neighborhood, sleeping in your bed? What would actually make you comfortable, hanging out on your block, or just being Black in this city? And so I think having the conversations with folks to identify what actually would keep them safe, and what would actually move us towards that safety has to be a part of it. And actually honoring people's fear as we ask them to imagine what that safety looks like. Because for so long, this is all we've known, right? One of the things that Adrienne Marie Brown says about capitalism that sticks with me is one of the worst things, if not the worst thing that capitalism does, is steal our imagination. And so folks can't imagine a world in which safety for Black folks actually really exists, or safety for them, and that we can actually hold that with each other. And so what does it mean to hold folks' fear and invite them into that imagination at the same time? Because it is possible, right? Some of this is about, in Minneapolis, the police department's only existed for 150 years, right? Our ancestors and folks before us had different systems of safety and accountability. And so it's some of that reclamation work as we are also going into imagination as well.
Yeah, I would, I think that's absolutely right. I would add that as of right now, not a single dollar has been taken out of the police department. Not a single tool has been removed from the police aside from chokeholds and crowd control limitations imposed by the state. And so what you're seeing, in my mind, is our current system fully operational, and our current system is just not designed to address this kind of a spike in violence. There are programs, there are things like that we do, and that we do as a city, but we just don't fund them very well, like our gang violence intervention program, that can work to curb this violence, right? But for anybody who's worried that the status quo has been disrupted, it hasn't yet, unfortunately. We're working on designing this new system. And so if people are not safe, it is the current system that is failing to keep them safe. The other thing I would say is that, I hear from constituents all the time especially as folks want to learn a little bit more about what we're doing, what the council's moving on, why we're heading in this direction. They are fearful because for so long the police have had a monopoly on safety, right? They're the only form of public safety that we have, and so people are obviously fearful because people do want to be safe. But people want to be safe, and even some of my neighbors, even some of my constituents who have maybe been most critical about my position here, have been forced to acknowledge, yeah, I myself don't have great interactions with the police when they come around. I've been disrespected by the police when I've called them to address an issue. Or that, I was under threat when the police came. They doubted my story. They didn't write down important details, and they didn't, take the time to demonstrate that they cared about my safety or my life. And so I think that that while we have seen this spike, and while we could speculate on all of the reasons why we're seeing that, I think that the laziest one, and maybe the most convenient one, is that people are calling for this drastic accountability and reimagining public safety. I think what would be more likely is that we were coming out of a phase of extreme unrest, which was preceded by one of the worst sort of financial crises, which was caused by coronavirus. We're coming out of the situation where people are strapped for resources, and that always sort of creates a ground for people to figure out how to keep themselves alive. And sometimes they resort to things that we as a community don't like, and they resort to things that aren't great for the community. But if all you try to do is squeeze them in a violent way, you're never going to solve the problem. And if we decide to lean in and understand that folks are resource strapped, that Minneapolis, even before coronavirus and before the financial collapse and before this unrest, was a place of abundance, but also steep disparity between white and black people and white and indigenous people, then we can start to make a little bit more sense of why we're seeing a spike in violence. And I imagine it has nothing to do with calls to reimagine public safety and hold officers accountable. So.
Right. And so we're coming up on the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Maybe if we could just close with just from each of you one really fast, hopeful thing, something that's really giving you hope right now as we talk about police defunding and the future.
You want me to go first, Miski? Or you want to take it?
You go first this time.
Okay. During kind of the height of the unrest and the rebellions that were happening over on the South Side, we saw that in North Minneapolis, the police, maybe for good reason, maybe for not, were completely absent for about 3 to 4 nights. And what you saw in that time was dozens and dozens of community members who decided that they were just going to institute a series of local community patrols, right? And people came out, some armed, some not armed. And they decided that they were going to coordinate. And I know that myself and Councilmember Cunningham were working hard to make sure folks were communicating and knew each other. But they came out, and it was really on people to prevent, violence or disruptions from happening for those 3 to 4 nights. Now, it might be unsustainable for a council member to be out in my car from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. checking up on people, but it was a glimpse at the kind of agency that people can take up. And the kinds of ways in which we can keep each other safe when our systems of safety are failing us. And I think that we should really hold those kinds of models and understand how do we make this kind of thing sustainable? Because we're being given the blueprint, even if by accident.
Miski?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think mine is like in that same vein, right? Like actually really seeing our people, and when I say our people, I mean Black people, and like specifically like our neighbors, like people that we know, take abolition from theory to practice, right? And so it's those community safety patrols. It's folks who are making sure that like there were fire extinguishers and Narcan on every block. It's the folks that have been setting up medic trainings. It's the folks who've been supporting the sanctuary set up in Powderhorn Park. Over here by where I live, just a couple blocks away from the memorial, folks, when the National Guard was here and the police were not responding, folks set up like a no cop zone, basically, where it's like, hey, if you're a protester, you can come here for shelter and water, and be good. And so, yeah, I think it's the ways that our community is showing up for each other and really showing us what alternatives look like, and doing it in real time, so that even for us who are like, yes, abolition, we can concretely see it becoming real. And that's been incredibly, incredibly inspiring. Because our people have what we need inside of us. You know, we have the conflict resolution specialists, we have the medics, we have the de-escalators. There are people who have these skills inside of our community, and it's about setting up the infrastructure to support them, and us to keep all of us safe.
Well, thank you so much for both of those answers. I think that's a really great note to leave on. And yeah, so Jeremiah and Miski, thank you for joining me. And thanks to our Intercept audience for listening in. And yeah, good luck in the work ahead.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us here.